Welcome to Brooklane's Facebook Live event, Coping with Trauma, Moving Forward. I'm Kurt Miller, Director of Public Relations for Brooklane. Thank you for joining us. We're offering this event in recognition of June being Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Awareness Month. Our mental health or brain health is very important a very important component of our lives. Thank you for joining us today. We're glad you're here. We also have Facebook Live events planned for this summer and hope you'll come back on July 16th for creating work-life balance and on August 20th for the importance of student mental health. You'll find more information about these programs on our website, brooklane.org. Our program today is Coping with Trauma, Moving Forward. It's presented by Fred Nastri. Fred is a licensed clinical professional counselor providing therapy at Brooklane's North Village location. He has over 45 years of experience working in the criminal justice, forensics, and mental health. He's a frequent speaker on a variety of mental health topics. Fred's unique background in working for the Maryland Department of Public Safety, Correction Services, Hagerstown City Police Department, and Brooklane has provided valuable insight about traumatic events and how individuals react, process, and heal from traumatic experiences. Fred, thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you for having me today, Kurt. Look forward today to talking about traumatic events and also, since this is Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Month, to help the audience and the group here today to understand a little bit about the effects that trauma has on people, families, and organizations as well. So what I'd like to start out with today is to help the group understand, first of all, what is a trauma and how do people get affected by traumas is certainly relevant to personality types, life experiences, and their ability to be resilient. And we're going to look at, first of all, how we do define trauma. I think one thing that's very important to understand is that trauma is universal, that it is occurring every day, every moment to people throughout the world, and that everyone responds to trauma in certainly very familiar ways that are unique also to sometimes the cultures that they come from. So first of all, when we look at a trauma, and we hear that word a lot today, certainly the definition looks at trauma as being a deeply distressing event. In order to have a trauma, you have to have an event that is associated with that trauma. Some of the things that I do as part of my private practice as well is that I respond to critical incident debriefings where there have been traumatic events in workplaces involving tragic accidents, violent criminal activity where people are victimized, natural disasters, and these traumatic events are where people are involved in these distressful events that have personally affected them. Many people's careers put them in these areas of trauma. First responders, we hear a lot about them today, certainly. Also people who work with dealing with tragic events, emergency room nurses, police, fire, EMT personnel, as well as people who become victimized, as I said. So a deeply distressing event will trigger a traumatic response. And that's how we look at what we're dealing with trauma. What happens is this traumatic event overwhelms an individual or individuals who are probably or maybe part of a group who witnessed this same traumatic event. An example could be a bank robbery, where you have a group of tellers working inside of a bank and somebody comes in and they pull a gun on them And this is a very distressing event that can overwhelm not only the individuals, but the group as a whole, just as an example. And their ability to cope. Coping strategies when these events occur get broke down because people go into what we call the fight or flight response, which is a physiological response once they are faced with the danger of a trauma. Now, traumas also occur when people are involved in tragic accidents, car accidents, accidents where they could be at home, where they could fall downstairs or whatever. Other events that create trauma for people are interpersonal relationship, where maybe there's domestic violence involved, where there could be child abuse involved, what we call relationship trauma, where people in their relationships have been maybe the victims of abuse, domestic violence. So there's a whole spectrum of events that create or overwhelm individuals' abilities to cope with trauma. Today, we want to try to talk too about moving forward from trauma, moving forward so that people's lives can be put back together after a traumatic event so that they are not struggling throughout their life with the memory or experience of that event. So we're also going to look at ways that we can move forward. And moving forward means that people can try to gain more control over their environment or over the event that happens. Because when you've been traumatized, feelings of helplessness also come over you as well too. You feel helpless in order to be able to respond to the event that has happened around you, which is consistent with that loss of control. So in your mind, you witness this trauma, the physiological response occurs, and you feel hopeless. You feel helpless. There's nothing immediately that I can do to try to overcome this situation. Traumas can be mild, moderate, or severe as we look at the spectrum of how we deal with traumatic events. So an example of a mild trauma could be something as simple as a fender bender car accident, where for the moment you feel traumatized by that accident. You make sure you're okay, you get out of the car, you see there's damage to the car, you're not happy about it, but you know that memory will be there of that situation. An example I like to use was my own personal example. Many years ago, on my way to work one morning, I was involved in a head-on collision here in Maryland at an intersection that I still pass by through today. Thank goodness I wasn't hurt, but my car was totaled, and I was not hospitalized, thank goodness. Certainly people do get hospitalized in terrible accidents like that. But every time I go through that intersection, pretty much every time, not all the time, but I have a brief memory of that accident. I can repicture that accident in that camera photo shot in my brain. Instantaneously, I think about it and then it's gone. No shaking, no anxiety, but just the memory of that accident. So that would be something of a traumatic event that happened in my past. Time passed by. I've moved past it. I've moved forward. No permanent injuries other than the loss of the car.
Fred,
Yes,
can I ask you a question, please?
sure.
Is it typical that when people experience this, that they are going to either have flashbacks to the trauma or process the trauma frequently in their minds in terms of reliving the experience?
That would be consistent and or relevant to the severity of the trauma, the personal involvement with the trauma. The fact is that if they were successful in seeing an outcome to the traumatic event that could be favorable to them, Was there any permanent injury to that trauma? So there's a lot of factors that go into it. Again, when we look at that, Kurt, it's again mild, moderate, or severe.
Okay.
We certainly look at veterans, and we hear a lot about veterans who have been traumatized in war, have witnessed terrible events, seeing fellow soldiers killed right in front of them in some kind of horrific ways. And we've maybe watched movies where we've seen these kinds of things happen. And when we even watch a movie that's very realistic, we feel some sense of fear itself and some types of empathy with those people going through that. So the way that these people cope or deal with it as they try to move forward can be successful, certainly, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to have a flashback, or they could actually, when it's a severe traumatic event that they have experienced, relive some of it by physiologically getting shortness of breath, almost like a panic attack, sweating. We hear of stories where, for instance, people who have been in battle, they can hear a helicopter go by, an automatic flashback to maybe when they were fighting the battles of the jungles of Vietnam. They crawl under a bed, they reach for a weapon, they begin to shake. So again, so much of it is based upon the severity and the ability for people to be able to be resilient, and again, based upon personalities. So good question there. Again, what else does traumatic events do for us? That's so when we have to make people kind of move forward, in many cases, it can diminish your sense of self or your ability to feel a full range of emotions and experiences. Meaning some of your abilities to experience life in general can be muted. You begin to lose part of what it takes to feel happy, to not experience the joy of life. Sometimes we'll see in people who have long-term traumatic life events, where maybe they've been abused in their families growing up, maybe sexually abused, physically abused, emotionally abused. As they go through life or they get older, they still have very graphic memories of those abuses. And we call that relationship trauma or relationship PTSD, which later on can hinder their ability to form strong relationships in future relationships. Or parental issues that are unresolved because of the distressing events that they have, and their full range of emotions and those experiences are muted, meaning they can't express or feel. We see that sometimes, and we look at it from an interesting perspective. Sometimes it can be a genetic predisposition that becomes more so prevalent through the nurturing of that individual. So if they're not shown love or care, they're constantly criticized or abused, they can't experience themselves happiness or show love and caring to their own relationship. And a lot of times they'll say that they don't have any feelings. They can't express emotions. And there are several cases I've been trying to help people with over my career where that's very obvious to me as to how they blunted the emotions. Cases where a client has told me their parent has told them that they wish they would have aborted them. Very traumatic when they hear a parent say that to them. Something that they can't ever get over, something that comes back to them and stays in their memory, which makes it very difficult for them to move on. But they have to move on, but they don't do it with a full emotional context. So they lose that self of emotions. Their experiences throughout life is what we're saying as well too. Some people have many experiences of witnessing traumatic events. Again, first responders, fire, police, nurses, and they see death they see horrendous death. And what happens for them as well too, sometimes emotionally, they lose that full range or sense of emotions. Again, trauma and helping them trying to move forward so that they can gain a sense of self again. Again, trauma is universal and it happens throughout the world, and everybody responds again a little bit differently based upon the experiences that they have. And it doesn't discriminate from race, religion, creed, color. Again, we see on TV today all kinds of different things happening in different parts of the world, including here in the United States as well too. And we see some terrible things that people do to each other. So we also experience secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, I call it, by witnessing it through the news, through the television, and we see all of these terrible things happening in different parts of the world. What about symptoms that people suffer or have that we work with people with, again, to move on from trauma? That's the whole thing that we want to help people do, because they come to us with these experiences. So how do you move on from this? What are the things that, first of all, that people come to see us for? Many people are sad. The sadness that these traumatic events bring to them. People who have lived good lives have very rarely experienced any traumatic life events, maybe none. But now they've been in a situation where it has happened. We see this a good bit with car accidents, where people are victimized by hit and runs. I'm handling a case for a company right now where a young lady who was a van driver for children in the DC area had her vehicle carjacked, and the perpetrator ran her down, broke ribs, broken arm, very traumatic, liver laceration, etc., etc. She is now, she was hospitalized, but she's going to have some permanent injuries. Very sad and angry at the person that did this to her. When people are victimized, sadness and anger. Why did this happen? Also angry at themselves at some point for putting themselves maybe in a situation where they became a victim. They blame themselves. There's a sense of denial that this could not have happened to them. Cases of sexual abuse where there is denial for long periods of time. They don't want to believe it happened, and they finally talk about it. This leads also to fear of, will people still accept me? Fear of rejection. People won't understand. The trauma then becomes, again, secondary to other people in their lives and how they're going to be perceived by those people if they tell them what has happened to them, certainly. Shame. The shame of it, embarrassment by why this happened, having to answer questions from people. Wow, I didn't know this happened. Oh, I'm so sorry. How did you let this happen? Did you tell anybody? Things like these kinds of things. So they feel shame because of it. If it was a relative, even more so devastating. Cases that I've worked where a father had abused his two daughters, was in prison for that, spent a number of years in prison. The two daughters still wanted a relationship with their father because he was their father. As traumatized as they were, they had gotten help, thank goodness, and they even visited their father in the prison. They wanted to overcome their trauma. They wanted to move forward. They wanted to be able to feel that he was better. The man was released from prison. A couple of years later, while I was working in this one facility in the psychology department, forensic department, I saw him coming down the walk that they had at the prison. And I kind of stopped and said, we'll say, John, you're back. What happened? And he shamefully put his head down and he said, I abused my granddaughters.
Mm.
What a traumatic event to his family, to his two daughters, now his granddaughters. The granddaughters were very little when he did it, as were his own daughters. Can you imagine the hurt, the sadness, the shame his daughters have felt? The emotional, traumatic event that will never leave them, now their own two children. This is an example of a very severe emotional trauma that was also a physical trauma to the people involved. Outbursts, anger outbursts that can happen to the people who have been traumatized. Again, based upon the injuries, based upon why they were put where they were put when these traumas occurred. Will they be judged by other people? The things that we look at as we look at how we're going to help these people move forward. Certainly, there are certain kinds of things that we do for treatment of people who are involved in traumatic events. And certainly, Kurt, if the audience would like to send some questions in for us, some points of clarification, we would encourage you to do that, because this is a very, very interesting topic as we go through these different areas. This is post-traumatic stress disorder month, correct, Kurt?
Yes.
And one of the things that we look at is post-trauma. Again, after the trauma has happened, whatever the trauma could have been, what and how do we as mental health professionals, how do we help people go forward? And the range of mental health professionals that work in helping people through this traumatic event are psychiatrists, psychologists, clinical social workers, licensed clinical counselors like myself, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and family and friends, religious, church, support systems that people need to move forward with. I think this is very important because we're moving to the post-trauma period. People who suffer from trauma can also suffer certainly from anxiety or worry. They become hypervigilant at times, meaning if you're involved in a car accident, a severe one, you will become maybe more vigilant when you get in your vehicle. That's not a bad thing, but you need to get into your vehicle because you need to drive for the rest of your life, maybe for jobs, work, whatever. But some people get paralyzed; they can't drive. They gotta get help to go back in and do it. So we have to help people become functional again, become one again, become whole, because a trauma can take you from the whole and fragment you in all different kinds of ways, psychologically, emotionally, physically. So the job that we try to do to help people is to try to put them back together again, because they will never, not ever, not become the same again per se. Meaning that trauma, based upon its severity, at some levels will always be there in their mind and their brain. So our job is to try to keep it down there, keep it repressed, minimize the post-traumatic stress that comes. If we cannot do that, we have what we call the disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, where individuals become less able to be functional in their everyday lives because this traumatic event has held them back. They can't focus well, they can't concentrate well. Fear, anxiety, sadness, and depression happens. People who have been sexually abused will again have some difficulties forming relationships again, because they can at times based upon the severity of the event. Certainly a rape is a terrible crime. We'll have trouble again bonding with someone else because just the event of getting close to somebody could trigger that memory, and they may also do what we call disassociate. Disassociation is where they kind of remove themselves mentally from the action or activity they're involved in because it's too painful to relive the actual event. We see this again where it's a more personal kind of trauma, mostly in sexual assault types of cases. Again, we work with the couples, we work with them to be able to form good relationships. And thank goodness, for the most part, most people are able to have good, healthy relationships after the traumatic event. Again, moving forward. It becomes more complicated when people abuse substances in order to self-medicate, in order to try to block the traumatic event from recurring in their conscious memory. So people will also who abuse substances after the fact of these horrific events or these traumatic events do so in order to minimize the flashbacks, minimize the experience of that trauma event. So we want to be sure we always address substance abuse issues if such. If people had some issues with substances prior to the trauma, they can become more severe post-trauma, certainly. Again, the disorder happens when people cannot function on a more appropriate level in their everyday life, and it's a struggle for them. Other treatments, of course, may lead to medications that are given to them to help them with their anxiety or depression. Again, depression and anxiety are common to the mental health professional, and a lot of times we do what we call cognitive therapeutic approach, along with medication if necessary. Cognitive are your thoughts, which lead to your feelings, which lead to your emotions, which lead to what we see, the behavior. The thoughts of somebody who's been traumatized can be in the unconscious mind, but are triggered when they see an external stimuli or something which reminds them of that trauma they suffered. I mentioned the bank robbery debriefings that we do when a teller has a gun stuck in their face, life-threatening, and the ones around them are fearful that they could be victims of immediate death if they don't give in to the robber. Well, some of those people come back to work. Some have to change careers. Some never are the same from that event. And they will never work in a place maybe where there's a public entrance or exit. But say a couple of years down the road, things are going okay, and they watch a movie. And in the movie, there's a violent bank robbery scene. Triggers that emotion again, triggers that memory of their own robbery. Now, that response is contingent upon how much counseling did they get after the event. Was there a crisis responder like myself? And when I go to these events, robberies of any kind, I always tell the victims that this will be something that they will always remember, but it's something that they can get over. That in the future, that there is a chance that they will have memories of this if they visualize or they see or they hear about an event consistent with what they went through. And I'll ask them, let's say 6 months down the road, you watch a movie and you see a bank robbery scene or you see a robbery scene. What's going to happen? Well, I'm going to remember what happened to me here today. Yeah, that's normal. That's right. But again, how did you get over this trauma? How did you get over this accident? How did you get over this tragic event? You survived. So I help them see that they are survivors, that they did overcome a tragic event. that maybe in the future when they talk to people about this event, in a way they can say, oh yeah, I was involved in a terrible incident like that. And in a way, some of them can use that as a way that they can build their inner strength, that I made it through this. Certainly the tragedy today of veterans coming back from war zones, there are very few who have been in combat that don't suffer from post-traumatic stress. The disorder happens when they're unable to become functional and that they are having difficulty in their lives because of those events. But they all have post-traumatic stress. Again, the disorder is when they're unable to be functional and live the life that they should be living. So progress is, first of all, when the person comes in to get help. Family members may refer them. They may be referred by friends. They may be referred because of work-related job problems, where a supervisor can refer them. And they can come in from all different areas, and as we try to get them to deal with what's going on. Shortly before I came in here today, I received a call from another group that I work for, and it's a trauma center group, and they needed to know my availability for a terrible accident where a work supervisor was killed in a highway accident scene, and 2 other workers witnessed this tragic death. Another person was badly injured. The company that needed us was one that wanted us to go there to be able to talk to the group about what they experienced. One of the other things we do are group debriefings and or group counseling of people who have been involved in traumatic life events. So these kinds of groups can help people share the event, share what they've gone through in order to try to move forward, so they can see other people too who have been in similar situations as them, and they don't feel what? They don't feel alone. Because many people who are victims of trauma feel alone. They feel isolated. They feel that nobody will want to know them or want to get to know them based upon the traumatic event, because they carry this with them. Their personalities can change. So we do groups, and initially we do a group debriefing, which I find to be very helpful, where we'll go right on the date of the event or shortly thereafter and get all the people together, even people that might not have been working that day, but who feel vicariously victimized or feel guilty. You've heard of survivor's guilt, right? Well, I wasn't there, but I felt for my friends that were there. I could have been there. Thank God I wasn't there, but I feel that now I'm afraid it could happen to me. So again, it can become vicarious guilt as well too. So we get people together. I help them process through what happened. I help them to tell me the story of what happened and how they were able to overcome that moment of the day. Different theories today on trauma and post-traumatic stress treatment to move forward. And that is not over-focusing on having the individuals relive the episode. Telling the story over and over again doesn't always help get the person to move forward, because you're bringing them back to that event again and then trying to bring them back forward again. I will try to let them guide me as to where they want to go with this. If they want to tell me the story, I'll listen to the story. If they want to repeat the story, I'll let them repeat it. But then there'll come a time when I'm going to say, okay, I think we know how tragic this was for you. Now we want to get you better. It's again like going in for a physical trauma where the injury has been taken care of and you want to continue to open up the wound. Now, some people are not only emotionally traumatized, but they're living every day with the physical trauma of the traumatic event that they were part of. Again, especially when we're dealing with people who have been in horrific accidents. So the trauma of the accident is consistent with the trauma of an injury now, where they may be paralyzed, they may lost a limb, so their whole life has changed. Again, veterans, we see this coming back where they've been terribly injured in the war and how they have to now get their lives back together again. And there are great organizations out there that try to help them get their life back in order as such.
Fred, another quick question for you. Do you think that there are any specific traits or situations that people would have that would help them perhaps be more resilient to what they might experience, to be, I guess, more of a survivor, or instincts that people might have that would help them through that process?
A very good point, Kurt. Certainly, the resilience is that of people able to bounce back from difficult situations in their life, that they move forward rather than they stay fixated or go backward. So what I have found out is that people who are able to move forward from traumatic events usually have good support systems in their lives, people who they feel care about them, that they themselves have this inner ability to overcome a tragic event, i.e. they have short memories. They're able to look at the situation, they're able to see what happened to them, but then they're able to put it back. They're able to put it back on the shelf and not pull it off again. So people that tend to be more extroverted, I would say more social, more communicative, and are able to not feel fear as much or feel as much inhibitions for not sharing it. So, for instance, American Legions, where veterans go from all different wars, they are a group of camaraderie groups who have this identity with each other, and they feel very comfortable going into places like that where they can share their experiences if they want to or not. So traits that one would have, again, being more outgoing, being more communicative, being less fearful, and we talk about being less fearful in general, that people who it takes a great deal to get worried about, or they're not anxiety prone, they're not worriers. People that tend to be a little bit more towards the anxiety, worry, depressed side tend to have a more difficult time with that as such. Not that people that are introverted can't have good traits as well too, they just do it more quietly. They read, they do things that are part of groups outside of them. And we know most people become successful and do move forward. They sometimes will look at their life tragedy and turn it around into a positive for them. So they take a tragic event, make it a positive by saying about how they were able to overcome what they did, and help other people who might have lesser instances of life tragedies or life events, and say, okay, hey, I've been through this and I made it through. You can too. So yeah, those are the kind of traits you look for in people like that, ones that have that ability to bounce back. They're usually successful in what they try to do. They usually don't dwell on things. They don't linger on things very long. They always have something to try to look forward to, something positive in their life to look forward to. So it's building resiliency, which is very important as well. They surround themselves with positive people.
Fred, I think our time is beginning to wind down here a little bit in terms of, I think our session may end, and I don't want it to cut off too abruptly. So I wanted to be able to say thank you and ask if you have any comments to conclude the program.
Well, thank you, Kurt. In conclusion, first of all, I want to thank the people that joined us today on Facebook Live and on behalf of Brook Lane. And I would say that never be afraid to reach out, to talk, and to get help. It's good to talk with friends. It's good to talk with family at times, but there are things that if you have them, that, you know, they've been inside of you for a period of time, or you've been traumatized yourself, don't feel that there are not professionals out there that can help you, that you can talk with, that want to be able to help you get your life moving in the direction that you want it to go in. That trauma, and I believe Carl Sandburg said that nobody goes through life unscathed. I think that was very accurate. We all go through our difficult times. Carl Jung, I always like to use Carl Jung, a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, and he had the basic factors for happiness. And if you had these factors, that these things would make you feel much better in life and get through almost anything. And quickly, it is good physical health as best as you can, health in your mental health, having a good support system in your life, family, friends, relationships, having an appreciation of the beauty of art and nature, things around you, having a philosophy or religious strength system in life that you can turn to, and also to have satisfactory work and a good standard of life, reasonably having those things in your life. All of those things, those basic factors, if you can kind of keep them there, a good life balance, never get down on yourself too hard, no matter what your life situation, and feel good about every moment that you can experience the good lives that you have. So
Thank you, Fred, very much. I really appreciate the time that you've given us today, and I think you've given a lot of good information to help people understand a lot more about trauma, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder, and how people can work to move forward. And I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Take care, everybody. Bye now.